Hey Science 9, so today we're going to cover lesson 6 from your notes package, food chains, food webs, and energy and ecosystems. So for today I'm looking for you to be really watching this, considering and keeping in mind your ecosystem in a jar project, which really is like a miniature ecosystem where living and non-living things interact with each other. And hopefully your ecosystem, survives this month or so that you've got the organisms in there for. We're going to develop notes for that concept, especially the notes that are called for are food web and a food and an energy pyramid. That's right. There we go. So first of all, food web. Food web is basically it's a who eats who of any kind of ecosystem. Whether any ecosystem, any place in the biosphere where living things interact with each other and with their environment, it's an ecosystem. Any such place will have a food web. You have different organisms, some of which eat each other, and often they're extremely complicated. Even in a very simple food web, you might have, say, 30 or 40 different species interacting with each other. Some of them eat only one species, others eat several species, some are eaten by several species, and some don't have any predators. Food webs show those kinds of relationships. So I decided for your notes, what I would do would be to put down a food web for a local ecosystem you might be familiar with, and then actually kind of develop the whole concept for your ecosystem in a jar project. So, you probably, a lot of you have been to Malco Lookout. If you haven't been, you've probably been to the edge of town. You cross the river, you get to the Bulkley River, and you cross it, and you get to people's pasture where they keep cattle and stuff. That kind of ecosystem is called aspen parkland. So basically you've got grassland used for grazing, and you got patches of trees. And those patches of trees, the trees are called aspen trees. And so I was thinking, well, what lives in that ecosystem? And I came up with a few things, and I made conscious decisions about what I will put in there. Here's the food web. So first of all, what I want you to notice is I have in this aspen parkland food web, I've got a lot of the major players of organisms that you may be familiar with, but maybe you haven't seen all of them. And that in itself is kind of a bit of a lesson. So we've got deer here. The aspen trees are those really big ones with the kind of like whitish bark. And we got willow bushes, grasshoppers, got a spider in the middle there. That's a caterpillar. Then we got a bird up here that eats insects, and then a falcon. You've probably never seen a falcon, but they're out there. And then a mouse. What the arrows show, I'll give you a better look at that, like that. What the arrows show is who is eating who. So an organism like, say, a deer is being fed by the willow, and it browses on the willow, and so we have an arrow going from the willow to the deer. So that's the nature of those relationships. Something I'd like you to notice here is what's going on down at the bottom. We've got these organisms called decomposers. When anything can have its arrow going down there, because decomposers use as their energy source anything that's dead. So the willow tree dies, it can be decomposed by bacteria and by fungi. Same for the aspen tree, but same for any of these animals right here. When they die, their bodies have some energy content, and that can be used by the fungi and the bacteria as their energy source. And so in that way, they're part of the food web. And needless to say, there can be things that will eat them as well in turn. So then I was also considering, what about looking at this a bit more close up? The thing about food webs is they kind of assemble themselves, they kind of build themselves wherever there are living things in the environment. Food webs actually just happen. And they happen at different spatial scales. They can be like huge, like the food chain for the tundra of some kind of river delta in the Arctic, or they can be so small as to fit inside your ecosystem in a jar. They're just who eats who within the ecosystem, however big or small it is. So let's look at a typical kind of soil food web. These have got lots of critters that you probably haven't heard of. So I put some up here for you. Again, notice we've got organisms, and they're attached, connected by arrows. And the arrow goes from the thing that gets eaten to the thing that eats it. Here are some things that might be in your ecosystem in a jar, even if you can't see them. So we got moss. I hope you all put moss in yours. We have fungi. I put a mushroom up there, even though most of the time fungi don't even make mushrooms. That's a little critter right there called a springtail, tiny little insect. They're really hard to see, but they jump around a lot. You know when you're seeing them. These guys here, just lines, those are nematodes. They're also called threadworms. They're thinner than human hair, but if you have a microscope and you're looking at soil, you find nematodes really quickly. That's also called a water bear right there, called a tardigrade. These things, if you guys come in at all, we'll look to see if we can find some. And those are mites. A thing to notice about what's going on with the soil food web is it's really complicated because a lot of these things eat more than one thing, especially given that there's more than one kind of mite, more than one kind of springtail, and so on. So we see springtails right there. They're connected by an arrow with mosses because they eat from mosses. They also eat fungi. Mites eat all kinds of stuff. They eat springtails, they eat nematodes, they eat tardigrades, but they also eat moss, and they also eat fungi as well. So mites have got all kinds of arrows joined to them. This is, again, not least because there's lots of different kinds of mites, nematodes, and springtails. So that's a food web for the aspen parkland, and then you kind of have a sense there. If you were to take a jar of soil from that same aspen parkland and look at the animals that are inside it, you would find that there was a food web inside that jar of soil in the same way there's a food web in the broader ecosystem. The energy pyramid is the other concept I want to explore for you guys. And I also kind of want you to know that this is a universal concept. You find food webs in all ecosystems. You find energy pyramids in all ecosystems. And the key thing I want you to know about energy pyramids is they always have the same shape. An energy pyramid, what it does is it shows not just like, which individual organisms eat which other ones. It shows the groups of organisms. Groups like producers. These are organisms that make food from non-living sources, like mostly plants are the major producers that you see when you look outside here. It also includes things that eat producers, also called herbivores or first-level consumers. These are different names for the same thing, organisms that eat plants. And then you got what we think of as the predators, organisms that eat the organisms that eat plants. And then there's even predators that eat other predators. Those are shown as blocks inside your energy pyramid. And the name for energy pyramid is not a perfect name. It's not a perfect name because they're not really pyramid shaped. It's better to show it as a bunch of stacked blocks. The bottom stacked block has the producers, like the plants. And the bottom stacked block is really big relative to everything else that comes after it. In fact, it's 10 times larger than this right here, than the how can I put it? Than the first box above it. It's 10 times larger as a box size because most of the energy that's in these guys here doesn't go into the next level up. What the energy pyramid does is it communicates to you the energy flow from one level of the ecosystem, like plants, to the next level up. And because this box is much smaller than this box, it shows us that most of the energy doesn't get up to that next level. But that pattern doesn't stop there. Most of the energy from these consumers doesn't make it to this level here, and then again for there at the top. The energy, most of that energy gets lost as it's being transformed from one energy level of the ecosystem up to another. So you might start with, think about it this way. think about how unusual it is for you to see a hawk. If you were to go into the, the pasture at the edge of town where people keep cattle and stuff, and there's deer, you see trees all the time, right? There's trees everywhere, and they're really big. To see a hawk, which is the kind of thing that's at the very top of the food chain, that's a little more unusual. You're going to point that out to your friend. Normally, if you see an aspen tree and you're out walking at Malco Lookout, you're not going to point it out to anyone because aspen trees are very common, and they're very big. They're hard to miss. What this is telling us is something about how energy pyramids are constructed, that the parts at the top of the energy pyramid, like your hawks, like your falcons, like your wolves, are much more rare. They're more rare because most of the energy that enters the ecosystem doesn't make it to them. Most of it just stays in the lower levels. Or more specifically, what's happening is energy is being lost as it's going from one level to the next. The guideline number that's given is 90%. 90% is lost. So if we imagine this as, say, 100% of the energy that's entered the ecosystem and it's become something living, like a plant, when it's transferred up to the next level, 90% of that energy gets lost. In fact, what's said is it's lost as heat. And only 10% is not lost as heat. Only 10% gets up to that next energy level in the ecosystem. So the natural question might be, well, is this something that's somehow special about some kinds of ecosystems? And the answer is no, it's not. This is a property that applies to every ecosystem that ever has existed or ever really could exist. Very basic physical laws are what make this happen. If you look at an energy pyramid for a marine environment, which I also suggest for the notes, you see the same thing. I drew one here, and I just threw in some of the organisms' names. So off the BC coast, some of you might have been to Haida Gwaii or something like that, so you kind of know what animals live out there. So in any kind of marine environment, you don't get, obviously, trees or bushes or anything like that. The plants that live in the ocean are mostly algae, single-celled algae and kelp, like kelp forests. So those are your producers. The plants that live in the ocean are your producers. They're sometimes called phytoplankton, but here's a word for you, all right? The first level consumers, the things that eat the producers in the ocean ecosystem, are called zooplankton. What the heck does that mean? Well, the zoo means animals, and the plankton means little tiny animals that live in the water. So, little tiny organisms that live in the water, because there's also phytoplankton, which is plant plankton. But this is like, if you were to see this under a microscope, they would look like a bunch of little shrimp. Those are your first level consumers, the ones that eat the plants that live in the water. Above that, you have your second level consumers in the ocean, just like on land. Because this is a classification, this is a grouping that works for the land ecosystems as well as for the ocean ones. In that case, the things that eat the tiny little shrimp-like things, well, they're mostly going to be little fish, like sardine and herring and so forth. And what eats sardine and herring? Whatever eats them is going to be the next level up in the energy pyramid. I mean, as far as I know, it would mostly be larger fish, right? Salmon, for example, most of their diet, at least some of the salmon, is going to be those smaller fish. And it's not like it stops with salmon. Of course, as you well know, all sorts of things in the ocean, including us, eat salmon. Within the ocean, there's I think there's like two groupings of different kinds of killer whales. Some of them that eat seals and so forth, and then some of them that are specialists on salmon. So in that case, that's going to be your top layer of the ecosystem. And remember, 90% of the energy is lost as each step goes up. So here's what things start by looking at, like in an ocean ecosystem. We've got a really big block right there. This block here is only 1/10 the size. The block above it, for the little fish, only 1/10 the size. The bigger fish, only 1/10 the size. And here at the top, we've got the orca. Killer whales, orcas, are really exciting, and when people think of ocean life, often they're going to be thinking, oh yeah, all the whales and the big fish and so forth. Now, yeah, they're amazing, but in terms of like how much of the ecosystem biomass they are, living mass they are, it's tiny because most of the energy gets lost as heat when it's being transferred from plankton to zooplankton to little fish to bigger fish to orca. That's what I want you to know about the concepts of food chains, food webs, and decomposers. Well, really everything you need to know for lesson 6 and to develop notes for that. This lesson is worthwhile watching, and the follow-up videos are worthwhile watching as well because it can help you gain a better appreciation for and be more reflective about your ecosystem in JAR projects. I hope this helps, and I'll talk to you soon. Just so you know, I'm going to be giving fairly frequent lessons here in Science 9 because there's another unit I do want us to touch on before the end of the year. Over and out. Have a good day.